Before we start, we'll get a little bit of context for our discussion, and that is to kind of get a little personal background on Amory, and to give you an idea of what he's been doing for the past 35, 40 years or so. And let's start, Amory, if you would, with the remarkable house that you've built, which is part residence and part RMI office in Snowmass, Colorado. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what makes it perhaps different than most other houses in the nation?
Yeah. Well, when my first wife, Hunter, and I founded RMI in 1982, we had already figured we wanted to move to the Roaring Fork Valley if we could find some land we could afford there, which we did on the last day of a 6-month search. And to build a nest in which we could attract a handful of colleagues. At the moment it's 83. I guess it got a little out of hand. Actually, over half of them are in our larger office in Boulder. It's less than half that age. But it's kind of like here, you know, it's one of those terrible places to live, but somebody's got to do it. And a place people want an excuse to come to, and a place where it's easier to attract the kinds of people we wanted. Most of the people we wanted to influence came there or owned a place near Aspen or wanted an excuse to come. And we had an ambition to help drive the efficient and restorative use of resources, because that's the best way we knew to create a world thriving, verdant, and secure for all forever. That's our vision. And the best way we know to carry out our mission right now is to get the U.S. completely off oil and coal by 2050. So that's our strategic focus. It will not solve all our problems, but it will help with a great many of them. So for the last, well, let's see, a year and a half until last October, we did a very ambitious piece of research funded with about $6 million of philanthropy and a lot of help from industry on both content and peer review. If you look at the credits in the back, you'll see what sort of help we got. It turned out to have quite a surprising finding that the U.S. could run a 2.6-fold bigger economy in 2050 with no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, a third less natural gas, and a $5 trillion lower cost than business as usual. That's a net present value, leaving out all externalities or hidden costs. So we're counting them all as zero, a conservatively low value. And we found that the transition to that happy state of affairs would require no new inventions and no acts of Congress, but be led by business for profit.
Yay.
So, in effect, we're showing how to use our most effective institutions, private enterprise, co-evolving with civil society, sped by military innovation, to run our least effective institutions, notably Congress. It's a very trans-ideological approach. That is, whether you most care about profits, jobs, and competitive advantage, or about national security, or about environmental stewardship and climate protection and public health, reinventing fire makes sense and makes money. Any one of those outcomes is enough to get you behind it, any one or more. You don't need to like all of them. You don't need to worry about or argue about which of them is most important. Just focus on outcomes, not motives. And that seems to be playing very well across the political spectrum.
Well, and speaking of across the political spectrum, a lot of the individuals who have provided rave reviews about reinventing fire and the work that you've been doing in general have been people like Bill Clinton, Paul Hawken, but on the other side of the fence, politically speaking, one might say the former CIA director,
Jim Woolsey, George
Woolsey,
Shultz, Glenn McFarland,
exactly,
Wes Clark.
Wes Clark.
Yeah.
So these are folks that you would probably not consider, who you might not find camping out with Occupy Wall Street.
No, I got a very good review the other day from a fellow that used to run the Republican National Committee.
So what's the common thread for these folks, do you think, Andrew?
Well, pragmatic, trans-ideological, business-led innovation that solves many of our most pressing national problems, and is already starting to happen very nicely. $5 trillion on the table is enough to get business leaders' attention. The military is already all over this. To declare an interest, I'm also a professor of practice at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I've been driving the military energy agenda for about 30 years. It's flowered beautifully the last few years. So there is now very strong military leadership in efficiency in both platforms and facilities. Part of the reason for that is that we figured out in a couple of Defense Science Board task forces that when buying the things that use fuel, the military was assuming that delivering the fuel was free and invulnerable. But in fact, when you properly counted its fully burdened cost of delivery to the platform in theater in wartime, that would often increase the delivered cost of the fuel by 10-fold, maybe 100-fold. Well, now the rules say you have to count it at that value. It took only 20-odd years to get that done. That means that prime contractors are starting to design things that fly and roll and swim to that value. And if you're designing an airplane against a value of, say, fuel of well over $100 a gallon, because that's what it costs delivered in midair, that's going to be a very much more efficient airplane than when you thought fuel was worth $2 or $3 a gallon. And that sort of technology will then come back to our civilian cars, trucks, and planes, which use 50-odd times more fuel than the military, and will drive the kind of innovation by which military R&D already gave us, things like the internet, the global positioning system, and the jet engine microchip industries. So that in turn leads to not needing to fight over the oil because we don't need the oil, and therefore neg emissions in the Persian Gulf, mission unnecessary. The warfighters really like that idea.
Well, speaking of externalities, you've been very, very diligent in describing what the true cost of our oil addiction is. Can you talk a little bit about what that true cost is based on considering all the factors involved?
Well, let me consider some of them. We pay about $2 billion a day to buy oil, half domestic, half imported. We also pay, through our incomes and taxes, another $4 billion a day, or $1.5 trillion a year, in three roughly equal parts. The first $500 billion a year is the damage to our economy, basically the money sucked out of it by our oil dependence, chiefly through OPEC's monopoly pricing, which our dependence makes possible. The second $500 billion a year is how the market values the volatility of oil price, which imposes cost and risk on every oil user. And then the third $500 billion a year is what we pay to keep military forces ready to intervene in the Persian Gulf. That happens to be about 10 times what we pay for oil from the Persian Gulf, and it rivals our total defense spending at the height of the Cold War. What's wrong with this picture? So we ought to be getting off oil just to improve our security and save money at the pump, and that is the only economic value that our analysis ascribes to it. We don't count the other $1.5 trillion a year. And by the way, that doesn't include any damage to health, safety, environment, global development, global stability, or our nation's independence and reputation. I think it's quite a conservative value. But even just the direct economic and military costs, plus the price of the oil add up to a sixth of GDP. We can't go on doing that.
Yeah. In Reinventing Fire, you address 4 energy-consuming, some producing energy sectors in the U.S. economy. Transportation is one, buildings is another, industry is the other,
and electricity, which uses a great deal of energy making electricity and wasting 2/3 of it.
Precisely, precisely. Yeah. Let's start with transportation and talk about some of the key principles.
Why do we look at all 4 sectors? Because in a remark attributed to General Eisenhower, if a problem cannot be solved, enlarge it. That is, if you can't solve a tough problem, it's typically not because it wasn't small enough to be bite-sized, but rather that it wasn't big enough for its boundaries to encompass the options and synergies and degrees of freedom that the solution required. So you have to shove the boundaries out until they do. And therefore we have to look at all 4 energy-using sectors: transport, buildings, industry, and electricity. And then you find that it's, for example, a lot easier to solve the auto and electricity problems together than separately. And we also needed to integrate 4 kinds of innovation, not just the usual 2, technology and public policy, but also design, the way technologies are combined, and strategy, new business models, new competitive strategies. When you put all 4 of those together, it's very much more powerful than the sum of the parts. It creates some deeply disruptive business opportunities.
These are deeply independent from you.
Very much so. And the reason I think so many people have found the energy problem much more difficult is that they looked at pieces of it, not the whole thing.
It's interesting you should mention that, because recently I've noticed that more than over the past number of years, that it's very, very difficult for many people to think in terms other than large, centrally located thermal generating units. It's rare that people can think in terms of locally produced, microgrid-based, islandable energy systems.
Which is where the military's headed, because that's how they can keep their stuff working. Well, the rest of us whom they defend want our stuff to work too. We ought to take the same route as Denmark is doing, as Cuba has done with great success.
You know, it's interesting you should bring up Cuba, because Martha and I had been in Cuba along with a group of people about a year ago, and we spoke to Alberto Avila, I think is his name. Yes, he's the gentleman who we talked about recently, who took RMI's principles, some of the things that you wrote about
in the 70s.
In the 70s, and applied them to a crisis that occurred in around, I think it was 2007, I believe, somewhere in that neighborhood where
well, they went from 224 serious blackout days in 2005 to 3 days in 2006 and 0 days in 2007 by distributed generation, netted islandable microgrids, which is a way of reorganizing the structure of the grid so it can break apart fractally and then reconnect seamlessly. And they did some efficiency, public education, and inverted tariffs. But yeah, it was straightforward, not very sophisticated, and since it's a dictatorship, they could move very quickly. I don't think I would like to live in Cuba, but it's a very impressive example, which I actually wrote up for Generals McChrystal and Petraeus when they were in theater as a guide to reconstruction. And by the way, the next year in 2008, 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks shredded their eastern grid, and they still sustained vital services.
Yes. Well, it's really proof of concept, isn't it? Because those generators are diesel generators. But
that's because they wanted to go to wind, but they couldn't get in the ordering queue fast enough. Everybody else had booked the orders years in advance.
Cuba is a remarkable example in many, many ways. As you say, because it's a dictatorship, they can get a lot done very quickly. But nonetheless, when it comes to proof of concept, especially for microgrids, it's remarkable. But on that notion of microgrids, we have some real examples here in this country. University of California, San Diego has a remarkable experiment, more than an experiment, practical use of microgrids. Arizona State University is just about to reach 20 megawatts of installed solar on their campus. It's everywhere at Arizona State.
So I was just at the San Diego one the other day, and you know, when they had the forest fire that took out the transmission line, they were able to switch from being a net consumer to a net producer in half an hour. And it really helped out the system.
What's unique about UCSD's approach?
Well, they have a mixture of fuel cell, gas turbine trigeneration, a bunch of stratified chilled water storage, photovoltaics with a fisheye lens that looks at the whole sky and forecasts what clouds are going to be where when, so they can forecast the output better. And then that's hooked to all of the building controls, so they can turn things on and off that you wouldn't notice as they need to integrate with the supply. And it's one of the most sophisticated of the 20 or so microgrid experiments around the world. Denmark is actually doing a similar thing with a cellular grid organization. That is microgrids that normally interconnect but can stand alone in need. And once a year they stress test it by turning off the main grid connection to make sure the stuff still works, which it does. The larger context of this is that we need to rebuild our electricity system anyway over the next 40 years because it's getting so old. A lot of it is obsolete. It's definitely and very worrisomely insecure. It's pretty dirty. And we could replace it with more of what we've got now, or with new nuclear build and so-called clean coal, or with renewables that are more centralized or more distributed. Surprise, they all cost about the same. They're all about $6 trillion net present value to keep the lights on for the next 40 years. However, they differ profoundly in risk for national security and around technology, finance, fuels, water, health, climate, environment. So when you look at it as a risk management play, cost being essentially flat across all the scenarios, you rapidly discover that the distributed renewables scenario with this microgrid organization is the only one that copes with the existential risk of blackouts. We could lose the whole economy to blackouts over very long times and very large areas caused by bad space weather, natural disaster, or terrorism. But it's the only scenario that solves that problem, and it best manages all the other risks, and it's the best scenario for customer choice and innovation and entrepreneurial opportunity. So we think it's a very good way to go.
Let me ask you.
I should mention, the book was just sent out by the head of the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade group of the shareholder-owned utilities that have about 4/5 of the market, to all of their CEOs. And the forwards to the book are by the Dean of American Utility Chairs, whose company is the biggest nuclear and third biggest coal operator, and the president of Shell Oil. And I'm a member of the National Petroleum Council.
There you go.
And I'm not making this up.
Well, you know, there are a number of people that have come this evening, and we talked a little bit about it in the car, that are interested in instituting in Monterey County and in Santa Cruz County community choice agriculture, kind of localized, not-for-profit, targeted buying of renewable energy.
It's like a virtual opt-in or out municipal or local utility.
Right, it's a cross between a municipal utility and an IOU, an investor-owned utility.
Yeah.
And it's a not-for-profit organization. Marin County has been the example. It sells its renewable, 100% renewable energy at just about a penny above retail, and it offers to its members 50% renewable energy at a comparable price or below PG&E's price.
Wow. Now, let me ask a dumb question. Some of you may know the details, which I haven't had a chance to look into. That 1 cent premium, if you want 100% renewable power, is that at a constant price with no fuel adjustment clause since there's no fuel?
Do we know that?
No, I mean, everything varies.
It does vary.
But on average, they will say it's on average.
But is it at a constant price?
I can't tell you.
Yes, well,
Yes.
yeah, they're currently marketing it as a one penny per kilowatt premium to buy the 100% versus the...
No, but here's why I asked. If you're buying PG&E power, a fair amount of that is gas-fired. Gas prices are very low right now. If they go up, as they will at some point, your regular utility rates would go up, but your renewable rates should not go up because there's no fuel in the renewables. This is what the Austin Muni did, Austin Energy, and at first you paid a premium if you bought green power, but then the gas price shot up and the green power was cheaper than the brown power, as it should be, and those people felt even smarter.
I believe that's so, Don, is it not? That it's a contract base.
It is. Right now they're selling it as a 1 cent kilowatt premium. How they're going to structure the price structure just in general, that floor price from which everything's paid, I don't know going forward.
That would be worth checking, because when people talk about cheap gas, they're leaving out the value of the volatility of the gas price. You can discover that value in the...
But it is a goal of the organization.
And it's actually worth more than the gas. So we're undercounting the what that cheap gas is really worth by a factor of more than 2, which is a very material error.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely, yeah. By the way, the speakers, Mary Kuna is here she's from Carmel Valley. She has been responsible for catalyzing the notion of CCA here in Monterey County. She brought the idea down from Marin and has attempted to put it forth here. Mary's right here.
CCA?
CCA is an acronym for Community Choice Aggregation. It's kind of like the Costco of energy.
Those in the community who want to have more choice in buying more efficiency, more renewables, and by clubbing together they can get a much better deal on it and use it as an overlay for the regular utility service. Utilities continues to run the wires and send you the bill, but you can get a different mix of services if you want, and different pricing, and generally get what you want more responsibly.
And it's local as well. And I wanted to also recognize Don Prescott, who's with the Regional Waste Management District, with CCA.
If I could just back up on that point, though, is that one of the goals of the Marin Energy Authority is to purchase and create your portfolio out of all renewables, so that we could avoid just what you're talking about, that risk of the natural gas. So.
And in fact, I have that kind of deal with my rural co-op in western Colorado. I make in the banana farm 100% solar in the daytime and sell back the surplus to run the meter backwards. And then at night, I buy 100% wind power. And that, it looks like we're going to end up being a net energy exporter, which was the intention.
So banana farm is an important concept, just to explain. Banana farm is the name of Amory and Judy's house. This is the thing we spoke about before, because, why is it called banana farm?
Oh, because we're at the moment ripening banana crops number 37 through 41 in the middle of the house, and the tropical jungle that the house wraps around. This is at 7,100 feet, where it used to go as low as -47 on occasion. It doesn't go below about -20 anymore, because Aspen just got moved 2 climate zones warmer in the official classification, which the SCICO is very unhappy about. Winter was short enough already. There's no furnace, and it was cheaper to build that way because we saved more construction costs eliminating the heating system, and we paid extra for the super insulation and super windows and ventilation heat recovery to let us get rid of the furnace.
One of the things that you've been long involved with has been the transportation sector. And one of the common scary thoughts for most people is if you lightweight vehicles, then they'll be more dangerous. And tell us a little bit about what you have found out about vehicle.
Well, that was long thought to be so because our safety agency in Washington said so, but it turned out they mismodeled it by assuming the weight and size were the same thing. When you teased apart those variables, you found that weight made vehicles hostile and inefficient. Hostile in the sense that the heavier you made the vehicle, the more people would die in traffic accidents. Fewer of them inside that vehicle, but more of them outside it. And the bigger you made the vehicle, on the other hand, the more protective it was, as well as perhaps more comfortable. So what we needed was to decouple size from weight and make the vehicles big if you want, but not heavy. Now, the best way to do that is with carbon fiber composites, and one of our spin-offs figured out how to make them cost effectively with aerospace performance. You can tell from the sound how strong and stiff this is. Also makes a good carbon capture. You can see it's extremely light, but that was made 7 years ago in less than 1 minute. And when you scale that technology, you save more lives because this stuff can absorb 6 to 12 times as much crash energy as steel and do so more smoothly. That's why carbon fiber race cars can run into the wall at 230 miles an hour, fly bits. The driver typically limps away with the most broken foot. Some bruises from the steering wheel and pedals, but the vehicles are very much more crash-worthy if they hit something real heavy. It would also greatly simplify automaking. It turns out the capital needs would go down by 5-fold, because you save about 98 or 99% of the tooling cost. You eliminate the robotic body shop. Sorry, Alfred. You eliminate most or all of the paint shop. And by the way, the propulsion system, the powertrain, gets about 2/3 smaller. And together, those things pay for the carbon fiber. And by the way, if we made all our autos this way in the United States, you would also discover by drilling in the Detroit Formation 1.5 Saudis or half an OPEC at $18 a barrel, and it's all American and carbon free and inexhaustible. So those mega barrels are really prolific. We're just drilling in the wrong places. I introduced this notion of ultralight advanced composite vehicles and combining that with hybrid because they're very synergistic 21 years ago. The first mass-produced ones enter the market next year in Germany from Volkswagen, BMW, and Audi. The Volkswagen one is 230 miles a gallon as a plug-in hybrid two-seater. I hope to be the first U.S. customer. That's gasoline equivalent, even though it's a diesel. The BMW one, they said, yes, the carbon fiber is paid for by needing fewer batteries. That's also an electric car. They said, we do not intend to be a typewriter maker. Because they can look across Munich to where Olympia used to make excellent typewriters. This shift to ultralight and then electrified cars, because you can afford to electrify them when you need 3 times fewer of the costlier batteries and fuel cells, that shift is as dramatic as changing from typewriters to computers. And of course, computers and electronics are now our biggest industry, and typewriter makers have vanished. So I can now count between 3 and 7 automakers, some of them in this country, that have adopted or are adopting that strategy. And if you adopt it, it's really hard for your competitors to catch up, because in, say, hybrids, there's only one learning curve of it gets cheaper as you make more. But this has 3 very strong learning curves that reinforce each other. One in the carbon fiber, another in the structural manufacturing, the third in the electric propulsion. And that combination gives a very powerful competitive strategy. So it gets us halfway off oil and saves twice as much as was thought possible, and at very attractive prices. And then it makes affordable the electrification that saves the rest of the oil. It is quite true that in the early years, even the much smaller electric propulsion system would put up the sticker price. But there's a nice way to deal with that we invented back in the 70s called a fee-bate. It's a cross between a fee and a rebate. So when you go to the dealer to buy a vehicle of the type and size that you want, there are different offerings with different efficiencies. If you buy one of the more efficient ones, you get a rebate, and it's paid for by fees charged on the less efficient ones. So you broaden the price spread within that size class so that you're going to maybe broaden by $3,000 to $5,000. So you're going to look at the full 15 years of life cycle fuel saving, not just the first year or two. So your purchasing decision will also be efficient for society. There are 5 such programs now running in Europe. In the first 2 years, the biggest of them, which is in France, tripled their speed of improving auto efficiency. This could soon come to a state near you.
By the way, if anyone in the room has something of value to exchange for this carbon fiber dome, you would initiate local carbon cap and trade. I sat for a long time with that one while I was here to speak. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Well, I was thinking of selling them in Israel as ballistic rockets. This is a test piece for military ballistic rockets that have been shipping for a couple of years. And with a limited supply of the ballistic fiber inside, so-called spectra, which is rationed weekly and so scarce, we've recovered 2 or 3 times as many skulls by sandwiching it in this stuff. So we like that idea.
Interesting that Tom Friedman took a sledgehammer to this. And
Yeah, he tried to smash it, but he couldn't even scuff it with a sledgehammer. It's tougher than titanium.
Well, it's interesting you should mention BMW, because BMW was one of the automakers that routinely broke National Highway Traffic Safety Administration CAFE standards. And now they seem to be almost the golden kids of life.
I love their engineers. They're tough and very good. And when I was giving a speech there almost a year and a half ago to where some of the top engineers, their head of research very graciously introduced me by saying, Mr. Lovins, when you were here about 15 years ago, you told us a bunch of stuff we didn't quite believe. I wanted you to know it's now our strategy, and we want to be typewriter maker.
Well, speaking of 15-year-old or more, notions that you have been responsible for, 2 of the ones that I can think of are the inventions of the term negawatts, and also, I think, global weirding.
Global weirding comes from Amory Lovins. That was a good one. Megawatts was actually a typo in a Colorado PUC document, which I picked up and popularized. They meant to say megawatts and mistyped it, but I kind of liked it and spread it around. So I can't take credit for either of them.
Well, they're real little gems, because they convey so much information in the word itself. I mean,
yeah. Well, I think there is an important novelty we've been cooking up at RMI for a long time that runs like a thread through all of these chapters on transport, buildings, and industry. And that is the notion that if you design a building or a vehicle or a factory as a whole system and not just a bunch of parts, you can often make very large energy savings cheaper than small or no savings. So you get diminishing returns turning into expanding returns. And our house is an example of that, where we save 99% of the space and water heating energy and about 90% of the electricity, all of the 10-month payback. Or the Empire State Building retrofit, where we're saving now 2/5 of the energy with a 3-year payback. The original proposal from a large energy service company was to save 7% with about a 3-year payback. But we managed to multiply that by a factor, let's see, 6 or so, just by doing a few of the right things in the right order. Like we took the 6,514 windows and had them remanufactured on site in a temporary window factory set up on a vacant floor into super windows that are almost perfect in passing light but blocking heat. And that plus better lights and lighting controls and daylighting and office equipment cut the maximum cooling load on hot afternoons by about a third. And then we could renovate the old chillers and somewhat reduce them rather than putting in bigger new ones, which would mean tearing up Fifth Avenue to get at the old ones. And that avoided chiller replacement, saved over $17 million of capital cost. And that covered over half the cost of all the improvements, hence the 3-year payback.
Remarkable achievement.
So we have we're working on one now in Denver. It's a major federal office complex, 500,000 square feet, which we think we're going to save 70% of the energy on. It's under construction right now. That would make it the most efficient office building in the country, even though it's 48 years old. So it's retrofit, not new, so it should be a lot harder. And in fact, it's a difficult building. It faces the wrong way. It needs complete asbestos remediation, federal blast resistance retrofit, and historic preservation. You can only change the windows from the inside. So it's a tough one, but that's how fast the state of the art is moving. I noticed on the table here we have a few CD-ROMs, if any of you are in real estate business or are design professionals. And if you go to retrofitdepot.org, you'll find a bunch of tools we posted for owners of real estate portfolios to figure out what to do in what order to which buildings. Normally they start with the biggest hogs. Actually, they probably ought to start with the ones they're about to do something to, like renewing the skin, the facade, or renewing the old mechanical systems, because then you can piggyback on that and save lots of capital. The same integrated design applies in all sectors, but it's most spectacular in buildings. We've so far used it to get rid of heating and cooling equipment from minus 47 to plus 115F with lower construction costs and better comfort. And the building opportunity in our 120 million buildings in this country is to save about $1.4 trillion net present value. Internal rate of return is 33%. That is, the savings are worth 4 times what they cost. And in industry, we've about doubled energy productivity with a 21% internal rate of return. Integrated design probably makes those savings even bigger and cheaper.
Let's talk about energy efficiency, because that really, when I was interviewing people recently about CCAs, for example, one of the things that I found was that energy efficiency seemed to be as important to the success of localized energy at a reasonable price.
Absolutely.
Could you expand a little bit about that?
Well, most of the energy we use is wasted, and the technology for saving it keeps improving faster than we install it. So the unbought efficiency, the backlog, keeps getting bigger and cheaper. And that means as we start to install this stuff faster than the economy grows, our electric demand is likely to shrink instead of grow, and that makes it a lot easier to replace how we make it. But meanwhile, we save a whole lot of money that can finance the new supply. How much? Oh, about $5 trillion net present value over the next 40 years. That does not count, by the way, larger hidden values, like if you make your office efficient with good design, typically people will do more and better work by about 6 to 16%. Why? Because they can see what they're doing, hear themselves think, breathe cleaner air, and feel more comfortable. Well, in a typical office, you're paying 170-something times as much for people as for energy. So actually, the way the math works out with tax effects and stuff, if you increase labor productivity by 0.7%, it would have the same bottom line effect as having a zero energy bill. But we see 6 to 16%. So that's an order of magnitude more valuable from just the labor productivity gain than eliminating your energy bill. Well-day-lit shops have anywhere from about 6 to 40% higher retail sales pressure. Well-day-lit classrooms, the kids learn 20-odd% faster. Green-efficient hospitals, there's now over 2,000 peer-reviewed papers showing better clinical outcomes. People heal faster, hurt less, return less, discharge sooner. So, you know, it's no accident that folks like Kaiser Permanente are leading in that kind of design. And these kinds of benefits are probably much more valuable than the $5 trillion of energy savings at market prices, but we're not counting any of that.
Henry, last question from me, and that is something that probably is a general concern locally, and that is that natural gas plays a role in RMI's energy plan. It's a consistent role, it appears, and we changed its...
The share stays the same, the amount goes down by a third.
And everyone is concerned about fracking. Your thoughts on the viability of fracking and how it plays in the future of energy?
Well, there are 6 or 8 major uncertainties about fracking. The long-term production profile, because there's a lot of extrapolation going on from steep initial decline and then some leveling off to what happens out here and how much do you need to keep refracking, which gets more expensive. There are big questions about the underlying economics if it's just a gas play and not driven by light sweet crude oil byproduct, which some of the plays now have. With Libyan oil off the market, that's worth a lot. But the gas economics are actually pretty opaque right now. There are uncertainties about the use of water, which can be very largely returned with best practice, but that's not followed in some places. Concerns about water contamination, air pollution, leakage, and other local impacts. Something like 50 to 70% of the wells are estimated at MIT to be getting so-called green completions, which are properly cemented, don't leak, and have good water flow, but that means a whole lot of them are not using that best practice. There are questions about induced seismicity, that is, does it cause earthquakes when you reinject water, and a few others. And I think, I guess a big one is whether the regulatory process and the underlying science will gain quality and independence quickly enough to merit and regain public trust, because there are some bad actors giving the industry a bad name. I'm recommending to our major oil and gas company clients that they set the gold standard, which would inconvenience them less than their competitors and be good for the industry. I think some of them may do that, but not yet. So, add it all up, lots of uncertainty. It'll take at least a decade for it to play out. If all of them are, all the uncertainties are favorably resolved, we will be happier to have more and cheaper gas than we thought. And if not, we won't be unduly disappointed because we weren't going to need that much gas anyway. And by the way, the gas that we thought might be needed in 2050, which is about a third less than now, instead of going up as officially forecast, that's probably conservatively high because, for example, we counted cogeneration of electricity and useful heat only in factories, not in buildings, which have a big potential. And we did not count any solar process heat for industry, even though some of it's already in the money.
Well, on that note, let's up a conversation.
I'm sure I said nothing controversial. I'm not a stranger to this area. I've been teaching at Esalen for over 20 years, and my 2 courses, as usual this year, will be in December. The first weekend, so it's one of these Friday evening to Sunday noon things, so 30 November to 2 December, Al Wong and I will be teaching our annual course on Taoism and ecology. And the following weekend, 7 to 9 December, I'll be teaching my annual energy course, which gets into depth on all this and many other things. And then also I'll be around in mid-August, and somewhere both those occasions I'll be doing some more teaching at the postgraduate school.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amory Lovins and Judy, thank you so much.